Now begins the recitation of the revelation word of the divine Avitaric Master, Paramasaptana Adidar Samraj. This is the Presumption of Cause from the Dawn Horse Testament. The presumption of cause is a principle and necessarily conditionally attained experience, form of knowledge, or form of belief associated with the ego I, and the necessarily conditionally attained belief in the ultimate cause and the search for necessarily conditional experience or knowledge of the ultimate cause is the ultimate occupation of the ego I. This notwithstanding real accausal God, or the one and true accausal divine person, which is reality itself, or truth itself, or that which is always already the case, is always already prior to the necessarily, conditionally presumed and pursued ultimate cause. Therefore, real accausal God is not the ultimate cause, the solitary and interested, or even deluded first doer of conditional events. Real accausal God, as real accausal God, does not make effects or even stand apart from them by causing them. Real accausal God, as real accausal God, is inherently indifferent and perfectly prior to cause and effect, or every apparent and apparently conditional event. Every apparent event, or every apparently caused effect, once it has appeared, becomes itself a cause of subsequent effects. Even every conditional being, with all of its limitations, is a cause and the effect of causes of all kinds. This is why the conditional or phenomenal worlds are a struggle with negativity and limitation. And real accausal God, as real accausal God, is eternally prior and indifferent to struggle, negativity, and limitation. Real accausal God is not the maker of conditional nature. Real accausal God is the non-conditional nature, or most prior condition of conditional nature. Real accausal God is not merely the cause of all causes and all effects. Real accausal God is the source and the source condition of all causes and all effects. Real accausal God is not the objective source and source condition of all causes and all effects. Real accausal God is the perfectly subjective source and source condition, or self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of all causes and all effects. Real accausal God is not inside or within the self-contracted knot of ego I. Real accausal God is always outside the self-contracted knot of ego I. When you transcend the self-contraction and the knot of ego I, you are free in real accausal God. When there is no ego I, real accausal God is not outside you. When there is no ego I, real accausal God is not within you. When there is no ego I, real accausal God is you perfectly, prior to your apparently objective conditional self, and perfectly prior to your apparently subjective conditional self, and therefore perfectly prior to your total, complex, and merely apparent conditional self. The conditional self and the worlds of the conditional self are not created by real accausal God, nor were or are the conditional self itself, and the worlds of the conditional self themselves perfectly originally, nor will or can it ever be the case that real or causal God, or otherwise the conditional self itself, or the worlds of the conditional self themselves, will perfect the conditional self itself, or the worlds of the conditional self themselves. But only real or causal God, or reality itself, or truth itself, or that which is always already the case, is perfect. For real or causal God, or reality itself, or truth itself, or that which is always already the case, is perfection, or the perfect itself. Therefore, the conditional self and the worlds of the conditional self may evolve conditionally, but only to possible conditional degrees, forever less than perfection itself, which is the condition only of real or causal God, and this through the struggle made by the submission of the lesser or the lower imperfect, or the lesser or the lower conditional, to the greater or the higher imperfect, or the greater or the higher conditional. And the conditional self and the worlds of conditional self may, otherwise, devolve conditionally, but also only to possible conditional degrees, and never to the degree of absolute or irreversible or more than illusory separation from real or causal God, or from the perfect itself, which is real or causal God, and this through the struggle made by the submission of the greater or the higher, or the lesser or the lower imperfect, or the greater or the higher, or the lesser or the lower conditional, to the even lesser or the even lower forms of the imperfect or the conditional itself. Nevertheless, and whatever the relatively evolved or relatively devolved case may be, the only way to realize real or causal God, or the transcendental and perfectly subjective and inherently spiritual and intrinsically egoless and inherently perfect and self-evidently divine self-nature, self-condition, source condition, and self-state itself, is to utterly surrender the imperfect itself, or the conditional self and the worlds of the conditional self, to and into real, a causal God, or the very and only and transcendental and perfectly subjective and inherently spiritual and intrinsically egoless and inherently perfect and self-evidently divine person, or self-nature, self-condition, source condition, and self-state, that is real causal God, and most ultimately and intrinsically and inherently most perfectly to transcend the imperfect, or the conditional self and the worlds of the conditional self, in and by inherent and inherently most perfect and perfectly subjective self-identification with the very and only and transcendental and perfectly subjective and inherently spiritual and intrinsically egoless and inherently perfect and self-evidently divine person, or self-nature, self-condition, source condition, and self-state, that is real a causal God. This is the presumption of cause from the Dornhorst Testament. Here ends the recitation of the revelation word of the divine avataric master, Paramal Saptana, Adidas Samraj. Da.